My strongest memory as a writer would have to be composing my first poem and sharing it with my mother. When I was in first grade, my mother was driving me home from school, and somewhere along the way I announced to her that I had made up a poem, and then I proceeded to say, there are 4 seasons in each year: winter, summer, spring, and fall. Which one do you like best of all? I like winter. That's when the wind gives its pleasant call. My mother was so surprised that she parked the car, and at that time we were only 2 blocks from home. And she asked me if I would say the poem again, and when I recited it the second time, she wrote it down. So I don't, I often say, I have no idea how I made up my first poem, but I do know exactly when and where I was. Because I started out as a writer writing poetry, my first inclination is usually to write poetry. Occasionally I do write prose, and that's when it comes to me more as a story. So my book Freedom on the Menu, the Greensboro Sit-ins, is historical fiction. So that's prose. But I call poetry my first literary language, so my first inclination is always to write poetry. And sometimes it's rhyming poetry, sometimes it's free verse, but it's almost always poetry, even though it's not automatically recognized as poetry, particularly in my picture books. I've been told that the text has been called lyrical, poetic, and I'm like, what? That's because it's a poem. That's because it's a poem. But thanks for noticing. I would tell my 10-year-old self, don't be so shy. Don't be so shy about your accomplishments. Um, just get out front. Get out front. Be a little bolder. But they're all personal to me in some way. The Gordon Parks book is personal to me because um, my aunt worked with him during the war years when he worked at the War Department, and they were friends. So that's personal to me. The Fannie Lou Hamer book is personal to me because she was such a strong woman and a hero of mine. Freedom in Congo Square is personal to me because Congo Square was essentially the birthplace of jazz. It kept African rhythms alive so that jazz could be born, a century later in New Orleans. And my dad was a jazz fan and introduced me to jazz. Not Carol, sit down, listen to this, but it played. It was the soundtrack of my formative years because my dad listened to jazz. So they're all personal to me. My most personal book, the book that's probably closest to my heart, though, is Becoming Billie Holiday because she's my muse. And that's I wrote about her for young adults and wrote in her voice, and um, I really, in a way, I channeled her for that book. I would want to be friends with Langston Hughes because his poetry influenced me as a young person. He may have been the first black poet whose work that I ever read. I was introduced to his work in elementary school by my teachers. We had to memorize his poems, and his poems were accessible. And of course, they were, rooted in the African American oral tradition, and also rooted in the community, in the African American community. So I would want to meet him and sit down and chat and perhaps travel with him. He traveled a lot, and I think he'd be a good traveling buddy.